All right, thanks for joining everybody. Welcome back. It's been a few weeks now. I hope everybody had a good few weeks and was able to catch the eclipse. I know I was able to see it with my family over here in Delmar, New York. We had cloudy skies, but still got to see it for most of the time. The time it was actually cloudiest was the few minutes where it was at the closest to totality, which was kind of a bummer, but we got to see the each side of it pretty well. Got some cool pictures. But today we're back to get another more detailed look at the scenario one results from the NISO. As you'll recall, last time we got a preliminary batch of results that still had some tweaks being made to them with regard to flexible loads and perhaps a couple other things. So today we're going to hand it over to the NISO again to walk through some more of those scenario one results related to the capacity expansion modeling. And this time they are inclusive of some of those flexible load um, uh, resources that we didn't get to see last time. As we did last time, everyone can just raise their hand using the raise hand function to participate and ask questions. Feel free to pop questions in the chat as well as we go if you have questions. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. We have the full 2 hours blocked out, but seeing that folks did have kind of a preliminary view of what types of results we kind of see through, we might have a little bit more time for discussion at the end, at which point we will still also have time to talk about the next sequence of meetings and topics. So before I hand it over to the NISO, is there anything else folks had questions about before we dive in? Okay. All right. So Kevin and Keith, like to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Skylar. The bulk presentation today will be from Kevin Ravis at the NISO. And with that, Kevin, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Keith. Thanks, Skylar. I'm gonna pull up my slides here. Can you all see these slides?
You're good, Kevin.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, just to give myself a quick introduction, I don't know that I've presented in front of many of you before. So my name is Kevin Ravis. I'm a senior planning engineer here at the NISO with the long-term assessments team. And as Skylar mentioned, today we're going to be talking about an updated version of the state scenario results. And these results, compared to last time, are more of a finalized version. So just walking through quickly what's on the agenda. So we'll just give a reminder on where the state scenario lives within the NISO Outlook process and within the CGBP process. We'll talk about some key considerations when it comes to the modeling and give the overview of the updates that have happened since the last EPPAC meeting. And then we'll jump into the results and the key findings from those results. So what this diagram shows is where the state scenario lives within the Outlook and the CGPP. So the state scenario is basically the common ground between the system and resource outlook, which is one of the big NISO reports informed by NISO stakeholders, and then the CGPP process that's obviously informed by all of you here at EPPAC. So just a reminder, the state scenario, also known as scenario one within CGPP, is where these two processes overlap. And some key considerations when it comes to the modeling. First and foremost, at the last EPPAC, we talked about some details on the assumptions for the state scenario. And, those are in, the March 25th EPPAC slides that should be on the EPPAC website, but are also available in this appendix, the appendix for these slides, if you want to reference them at a later time. And so, just as sort of a reminder, the primary drivers for the results here and the resource mix that the model predicts is largely based off of three different factors. And the first one being the load, if you have more load, it's going to require more resources in the future. There's also policy mandates that are included in the model, specifically 70 by 30 and then 100 by 40. And then finally, the costs. The model likes to pick resources that have lower costs than others, while also considering things like how much capacity is required in ELCCs and things like this. And then finally, when it comes to the projects that are coming online before 2030, a lot of them are a result of awarded renewable projects that have contracts that are more of like firm resources that will come in online by that time. Okay, so just to talk about what has changed since we presented at the last EPPAC. So these results include flexible loads. And I just want to clarify, what flexible loads means in this instance. The flexible loads is specifically referring to light duty electric vehicle charging. And so the flexibility is primarily coming from those when it comes to these results. But there's also another form of flexible load within the model, and that is electrolysis load. So I won't touch on that too much unless we want to discuss it later. But these flexible loads are specifically for the light duty EV charging. And the assumptions for these flexible loads, specifically EV flexible loads, are informed by the integration analysis. And so data that was provided in that analysis was used to inform this model. And then finally, another change that was made is these versions of the results enforce age-based fossil retirements exclusively. We had seen that the model still had the option to do economic retirements if it so chose. And that's not something we wanted. We only want to enforce age-based retirements within the state scenario. So that was updated as well. So I'm going to jump to the next slide, which has results, but overall, the trends are very consistent between what was presented last time. There's not a huge change, but the addition of flexible loads, and those flexible loads are also contributing like firm capacity, meaning they have value when it comes to like IRM. What that does is it essentially reduces the need for 3.7 gigawatts of new built capacity. So it's like a trade between load flexibility and resources that are required. And then finally, I mentioned the updated generator retirement assumption. What that does is it modifies the transition of fossil retirements, but the ending result is the same.
We have a question. I think Bill has his hand up.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Skylar. Yeah, Kevin, thanks for taking us through this. You mentioned that the flexible loads modeling was informed by the integration analysis. Can you give us a little more texture on how the flexible loads are incorporated into the model? My understanding is this is daily, so I'm wanted to see how an EV load is shifted in the model.
Yeah, sure. Happy to describe that in more detail here. In terms of data that comes from the integration analysis, the load that we're using for the state scenario model also comes from the integration analysis. And some of the data that is provided there is both peak load without flexible loads and then peak load with flexible loads. And the difference between the two is, okay, the load with the flexibility is lower. So essentially that provides us with like a quantitative measure of how much flexibility should be incorporated or how much it should affect load. So that's like the basis for the numbers that go into the model. In terms of the technique, the way that we've done it is we've essentially modeled this flexible load as a battery. So, similar to how batteries operate, it gives flexibility to when to serve load and then when to discharge. And then it has a certain duration that it's allowed to do that for. So, I mean, essentially what happens is the model chooses to move load that would otherwise occur at peak into the middle of the day when there's more solar resources available. So, you know, that is the nature of the modeling. Does that answer your question, Bill?
I think so, Kevin. Let me just test one more thing. So you're shifting the load within the day, and you're not shifting it out of a day. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And, you know, given that it's representative of the EVs, that seem to make you know, logical sense that the shifting would occur within a 24-hour period.
Yeah, I think this is a reasonable approach. I guess I would argue with that second statement a little bit. I mean, I think it's, you know, for passenger car EVs, at least, people frequently charge only, you know, once or twice a week. And so they could easily shift from Tuesday to Friday, for instance.
Mm.
But I think from a modeling perspective, you know, what you're doing, first of all, that would be really hard to incorporate in your models, my understanding. And second, it's probably as a first pass this is reasonable, but we might want to think in the future of other shifts that are interday instead of intraday. But for now, I think this sounds good.
Yeah, appreciate the feedback on that. And you're right. It's like this is the first pass that we've had in modeling something like this. You know, it seemed reasonable, but agreed that there's room for improvement on, you know, what the more like long-term impact would be on a not daily basis. So yeah, agreed with your point there. Are there any other questions at the moment?
One more hand, Anna.
Yeah, thanks. Anna Summer from Energy Futures Group on behalf of WeAct. I guess I have two questions for you, Kevin.
Mhm.
A lot of the work that we do involves generation planning, so transmission is tangential or just not even evaluated, and it really is about, you know, how much of a particular resource or combination of resources you build. And so I'm kind of trying to rewire my brain to think about this just from a transmission standpoint. And it seems to me that the thing that really matters here in terms of whether the model builds transmission or not is what is that peak transfer between the zones. Is there a way for you to provide that information to us so we can understand, you know, is that a matter of you know, single hours worth of demand or multiple consecutive hours worth of demand, or something else would help us kind of understand what's driving the transmission build out?
Yeah, so you're trying to understand how the load flexibility would impact peak load within the zones and how that would affect transmission. Is that my understanding of your question?
Right, or whether it has any impact at all. You know, is that is that just sort of shifting load through time, but you still need the transmission because you need to increase transfer capability regardless of when that load occurs? I guess I'm just trying to understand what are the drivers of the transmission build out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my understanding is that, you know, having flexible loads should provide some benefit when it comes to, you know, peak load, and perhaps with that affect, you know, how much transmission is required. Just to clarify, in terms of like the capacity expansion model, is we're not necessarily modeling any sort of like bulk interzonal transfers or expansion within the CapEx model. There is consideration for like headroom, you know, how much additional headroom would be required by putting certain resources within certain zones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So your model is entirely copper sheet. You just have these headroom assumptions that you have to sort of unlock to get more of a particular resource.
You definitely right about the headroom piece. On the copper sheet, I would clarify that we have, interface limits modeled. So like Central East, Dysinger East, and, the large interzonal limits are modeled, but they're not, they're like fixed. They're not, they don't expand over time.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay, gotcha. That's helpful to understand. Thanks.
Yeah. Aside from, like Clean Path and like transmission projects that are basically scheduled to come online at a specific point, those will be included. But outside of that, it doesn't expand.
Okay, gotcha.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else before I jump to the next slide? Okay. Thanks for the questions. Okay, so what's being shown here is a summary of the results. Again, this should be familiar relative to what was shown at the last EPPAC, but what you'll see here is, a heavy reliance on solar UPV to meet the CLCPA targets in 2040. In addition, you'll see a lot of defer capacity that comes into play in the later years, but there's a lot of capacity, but not a lot of energy from those defers. And what that's telling us is, this capacity is specifically being built to support LCRs. So like the regional capacity requirements that are downstate. So, so yeah, that's kind of the main story of what is happening here. What's been provided, and I think might be new from last time, is we broke out the electrolysis load, and there's also the load being flexed by EVs, so you can reference those. But the majority of this should look familiar. So I will just jump to my last slide. I have one more, and then I'm happy to come back to these results and talk about any questions. But just to kind of get to the final findings here, is what the model is indicating is that we'll need approximately 130 gigawatts of generation capacity by the end of the study period to achieve these policy mandates. And this includes both existing and retrofit units. It's the firm builds from awarded contracts, and it's generators that is selected by the model specifically for expansion. And this last bullet here kind of highlights what I was just discussing about the defers, how it builds those defers specifically for capacity requirements as opposed to actual generation, while the system instead relies on the renewables for actual energy. So with that, that's all that we have prepared for today. Happy to take questions.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, Kevin, just Bill Acker again with Airbus. Just one more question here. The defers here, just remind me, is this assuming all hydrogen, green hydrogen based with electrolysis defers, or is this assuming a mixture with other defers?
Yeah, it is assuming all hydrogen-based green hydrogen defers.
Okay. And is it still 50% of the hydrogen comes from in-state?
Yes, that's right. It's
Yep.
Yep, 50%.
Great. Thank you. I guess the other very simple question is, you guys might have already shared this. Is this being shared to the group, or did it already happen? I'd like to look at the tables more carefully.
Yeah, of course. My understanding is this will be posted on the EPPAC website.
Great, thanks.
Yep, that's right. Thanks. Okay, Radhika?
Hey, thank you for the presentation. When we had the presentation on the initial results, I've asked about this, about any geographical, like zonal distribution of all those renewables in particular. Would that be presented at another time or as a follow-up to this meeting? It will be very good for all of us to see where the geographical distribution of all those new megawatts.
Right. My understanding, yeah, certainly understand the importance of seeing that level of detail. And I think that our plan is to come back with that sort of information. I don't know specifically which EPPAC we'll be doing that at, but yeah, we will be bringing information like that back.
Thank you. And Kevin, I assume that's the case as well. There were questions before on those constraints, the headroom constraints, and it will be very good for the EPPAC forum to understand whether those constraints are hitting the model, if they are, discuss any sensitivities to relaxing or other items around those constraints, because if they are hitting the model, that means like generation is change, the mix is change. So it will be good to see how the generation location could be different if those were higher or they were not enforced. Just as a way of sensitivity.
Yeah, understood for sure. And yes, same with the headroom. I believe that's information that we'll be bringing back. It's just trying to figure out when, but yep, understood.
Thank you.
Rada?
Thank you, Schiller. Sorry if I'm asking a question that was discussed already in the last call I had to miss because of conflict, but I'm trying to understand the graph below where you have the capacity factor labeled as capacity factor. What is the black line that comes to zero? It like goes all the way to zero in 2040. What is that back line? Is that the native load? Or is it other generation?
I think that is other generation. I think that is confusing relative to the legend that's here. Whereas native load is a black line, which would be representative of the load within the tail or the figures above.
Okay.
This dark line is this other.
Yeah, I assume so because you're talking about capacity factor. Thank you. So
Yeah.
why is that happening? That zero, like what are these resources that are like ramping down to that 0%?
I think the resources that go down to zero are probably carbon emitting. So
Okay.
due to the CLCPA 100 by 40, they end up going to zero by then. And that's the same with, like the fossil line, going to
Right.
zero at that point.
So where is onshore wind in this, which is the lesson for that one?
I think onshore. Yeah, I apologize that, this legend is not that great with the capacity factor chart here. I think the onshore is this lighter green here. So,
LBW, that's how you move.
yeah, so the land-based wind is,
Okay.
getting
Okay.
in the 20s.
Got that. So you're showing the differs as for 0% consistently here for the capacity factor. And does it go up or is it stable at 0%? Is that the interpretation? And I don't see ECR even here.
Yeah, so the differs, it makes sense when we kind of pull all of these together. Like the differs start to get built in 2035 and 2040. And you're right that there's a period where there's no differs online. They come online, they're not really running. And then you get to 2040 and they're barely running. And it's kind of showed by this smidgen of defer gen here. But yeah, because defers are so costly from an operating perspective, the model does not really run them. And instead, they're really there for, just sort of the capacity requirement. So that's what's happening there.
Okay. So though you say it is a capacity factor, it is basically annual generation. That is what you're showing here.
Yeah, the capacity factor is the percent of annual generation that is produced relative to what it could have produced if it was running like full out the entire year.
Okay, makes sense. And you don't see ESRs anywhere here, though I see them in 2040 and 2042, that purple line on the top. And I don't know if we have a graph for that one anywhere.
Yeah, because the ESRs are relying on other generating resources. Yeah, we don't really show the capacity factor for that reason.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Skylar. Two more questions. Well, one's more of a comment, but these are very interesting results, and I think it's not surprising that the DFRs barely run. It really does illustrate that there likely is a great opportunity for long duration storage that would run to displace a lot of those DFRs. And we have this gap in our vision because we only model DFRs and short duration storage and not long duration storage. So I know we're not going to be able to address that in this first round of the modeling, but it is something that I think it really illustrates the need to do that in the second wave of the modeling as we go forward to accurately include long duration storage. And I think from a state steering perspective, it's incredibly important because it may be a much more cost-effective solution than building, as many things that barely run at all. Not that we certainly acknowledge we will need some of them anyway, but it may be a different mix. The question is that it gets back to the zonal question that was just asked. You commented that you're going to come forward with the zonal information, and that's going to be really helpful. I'm curious, when you added all the flexible load, did you see much of a shift zonally for your resource build?
Good question. I'm trying to think about what we're seeing there. Honestly, no, I don't think that it really affected the zonal distribution, and that's because the flexible loads also got distributed zonally. So within each zone there was a certain amount of load, peak load that came down, and therefore kind of based on that ratio, the capacity went down. So it wasn't necessarily that impactful on a zonal basis, if that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, I guess the root of the question, I'm not surprised by that answer, but part of the reason why I was asking the question was I was curious to try to tease out a little bit of sensitivity. If we had a lot more flexible load, what would happen, which is hard to answer, and it is a little bit in one of our other scenarios. But as I'm thinking about this, it's also interesting how the flexible load is distributed geographically, and I think. And maybe I should test this at a question, but I think you're biasing the electrolysis load to upstate, but your EV load, I'm assuming, isn't just a ratio, but maybe it is just a ratio of total load. How are you distributing the EV load? And second question, are you distributing the electrolysis pretty much all to the cheap zones upstate?
Yeah, so on electrolysis, you're right. It gets distributed through zones A through E.
Yep.
Assuming that's where it makes sense to have those sort of facilities. On the EV load, we were provided some information about how the total EV load was distributed zonally, and we were able to use that to also distribute sort of this flexibility. So it's based on where the EV load was assigned in the first place.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right.
Chris?
Any other questions?
Thanks, Skylar. Chris Wentlet, just a real quick question that follow up on that. Are you assuming any seasonal variations in that ability of that load to react? So for example, winter versus, let's say, a spring and fall period.
We are not assuming any sort of seasonal variation. There is some data provided that does have that seasonal flexibility, loads, capability. Like there is some of that data provided within the integration analysis, but for simplicity, we use the average of those seasonal values. So it doesn't include the variation at this time.
And to that point, it might be an area you should at least think about, in that if in fact we're heading toward a winter peaking system as we get into the 2030s timeframe, and you maybe take on different levels of risk associated with it, that that could have impacts on the percent of load that's able to react.
Yeah, understood, Chris, and thanks for the point. I think it's a great point. Yeah, we will consider that in future modeling. I think you're onto something good there. Anything else?
I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment.
Okay.
People still jump in with questions or comments on the process, but I'm going to switch now to the steps moving forward. As we mentioned, there's still more information being developed around this this study. You know, we're trying to present additional results on a more granular basis by zone. Eventually, we also are trying to get more information on the headroom analysis to see how the model's making decisions on headroom and where to expand that. So those results, hopefully, we can come back with in the next few weeks. But we'll have to work with an ISO to see when those results are prepared and see when we can get that on the calendar. So we don't really have a full next step for the EPPAC meetings in the next 2 weeks, so we don't have anything on the calendar at the moment. But obviously, like I said, we're waiting to see, maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we might be able to bring the NISO back for an additional presentation. And we're also hopeful that within the next few weeks, we may have additional results to share around proposed siting methodology. And if you recall, that's the information around how zonal capacity expansion results will be translated into local kind of nodal results for stage 2 and stage 3 of the CGPP. The JU are hard at work developing that. So hopefully sometime within the next month or so, we'll be able to have an EPPAC meeting on that as well. We don't have an update on what the next meeting is going to be yet, but hopefully we can reach out in the next week or two. We do plan to keep these Monday afternoon meetings. They seem to work for most folks. So hopefully either, maybe last week of April or sometime in May, we'll have another one of these where we can share more results. But nothing yet. You'll be getting an email from me and probably an update on the EPPAC web page soon about when the next meeting will be, but nothing today. So with that, I think we're going to close. I don't have any other additional information to share today. Any questions or comments? Okay, Radhika?
Thank you, Skylar. One question just on the phase 1 by memory on the CGPP timelines. We had stage 1, which is the assumption, what we have been discussing today, scenarios, assumption in New York ISO modeling. And I believe it was to be closed by June 1st. Is that your timeline too for this phase 1, stage 1?
Yeah, our initial calendar for when we were trying to develop a calendar, that we could fit to have a final report done by the end of 2025. I think we are still trying to hit that, although the timing is going to be a little bit difficult with the additional effort we've had to put into the state scenario modeling and the fact that we're just now starting to get to the kickoff phase for hitting run on the scenario 2 and 3 modeling. So I think June might be tight in terms of having stage 1 completely wrapped. But we are working, like I said, in the background of those transitional times, those transitional pieces of information that are going to help us move rapidly into stage 2 and 3. That's hopefully still, on track. So I think the main thing we'd be waiting for is just final results of the capacity expansion models.
Thank you. And in terms of like sequencing, will that with the how will it work? You have presented preliminary results of what might be final for the stage scenario, state scenario. However, some of those details on zonal distribution and things that we have been asking are missing. Like how do you envision like all this to sequence? Will the TO start building the nodal models soon, or like how will this be?
Yeah, I think that's some of the work that can happen in parallel. The JU have a lot of models and a lot of data that they can collect before they have final zonal, capacity expansion results to translate into those models. So I know there is some model development that is underway that can happen before these results are finalized, which is good. That's essentially, getting a head start on stage 2 so that we can run right into it when the stage 1 results are done. But in terms of the next steps here, one way it could play out is, say, the first week of May, we have another presentation or something that wraps up kind of the local results of the state scenario 1. And at that point, we would say something like, these are the final results. This is the information that we're going to turn over to the utilities to work on stage 2 for. We'd have similar meetings for scenarios 2 and 3 as well, where we would present the results, look through the more granular information, and then say, okay, these are done, these are ready to move to stage 2 as well, and then the utilities would be off and running. I saw Liz's hand up go up while I was talking.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I did raise my hand only just to remind everybody that sometimes Skylar or I, we might say we or we might say us, but what's really happening is, the TOs are responsible for carrying out this, this planning process. We are hosting the EPPAC, but what we're talking about here is work that the utilities are doing. That's all.
That is a good point. I am in no way touching any power flow models. I promise. I'd break it anyway. Anna?
Just to follow up on Radhika's question, for the stage 2, would it be, is that issue ripe for discussion about how chronological, hourly information will be produced and how hours will be selected? I'm assuming that because we're moving to power flow in the next stage, that you have to pick and choose which hours you're actually looking at. So would that sort of methodology of how you do that, how you take the information from LTCE and Plexus and put it into these power flow models be ready for discussion, even if we haven't completed the modeling in LTCE?
I think so. I think that's, we're just moving into that stage right now. I think the way the sequence is probably going to work out here in cycle 1 of the CGPP. Hopefully not in the future. Hopefully we're kind of doing more things in parallel in the future. But in this first cycle of the CGPP, we've been talking mostly about this state scenario, the scenario 1 of the CGPP.
Yep.
And scenarios 2 and 3 are still, about to be kicked off through the capacity expansion modeling. But the utilities are simultaneously working on exactly what you just mentioned, trying to develop a methodology for how those pieces of information will be translated and how those cases would be set up in their power flow simulations. And so that methodology is something they're thinking through right now, and we'll be presenting kind of that methodology, that proposal over sometime in the next month or two, hopefully. Okay. We'll be bringing it for a full presentation on that. So we'll have a lot of time to hopefully react to that and then discuss it live on one of these calls in the future.
Okay, that's great. That's all I'm looking for, whether it's, 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now, is just an opportunity to weigh in before that methodology is finalized.
Yeah, yep.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions or comments?
Maybe one more, Skylar.
Sure.
On there was discussion in the order, and we had some discussion maybe some calls ago on sensitivities to be run in stage 1. Will that also be happening after at some point in as part of the stage 1?
Yes, sensitivities will happen probably in parallel with some of the future work. We're prioritizing the setup of the stage 2 model and the initial, scenario 1, 2, and 3, the initial runs. The sensitivities themselves were a little bit bound by both time and amount of modeling resources and effort we have available to us. There are a number of sensitivities that will be run on the state scenario just as part of the system and resource outlook process at the NISO. And then similar sensitivities are under development for testing under the scenarios 2 and 3. So we'll have to see, how much time and resourcing we have available through the NISO to pull off these sensitivities. But if, certain sensitivities become really important, we will hopefully be able to make some room for those things to happen. So definitely keep that in mind and kind of keep a list of the things you think are the most important sensitivities on some of these scenarios.
Thank you. And I know at the New York ISO level, the last update I remember is New York ISO offering some potential sensitivities, but also asking for feedback. So I assume at some point, as part of the EPPAC forum, you will also send us some communication on the sensitivities that they are planned to be run for additional feedback.
Yes, they're not locked down yet, especially for scenarios 2 and 3. We haven't even kicked off the initial capacity expansion runs there. So it's hard to tell exactly, which sensitivities would be the most helpful on those. I think we're getting to that point with the state scenario once we are able to get everybody some feedback, get everybody's reactions on the state scenario, like zonal results, how the headroom's playing out, just to make sure there's nothing we need to kind of check or test through a sensitivity or even through a model adjustment. So that's something that we're getting to right now.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts? Oh, we actually got a question in the chat. The NISO is still available. It says it looks like on the last slide, emissions in 2035 might have been higher than for 2030. If that's true, could someone explain that? And I don't have the slides for me. Sorry, I can't check that.
I am looking at that. I believe that is accurate. I think it's largely driven by increased load. And while the fossil units are still online in that year, they run more before they run less. So that's kind of the driver.
The last hurrah, you might say.
Basically.
Sorry.
Yeah, load is ramping pretty rapidly in the 2030s. So that a good note to check on, to make sure that our clean generation can stay, can keep up with that.
Yep.
So good note. Thanks for catching that.
Yeah, good catch.
Okay. Well, all right. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for the great discussion. As we mentioned, these slides will hopefully be posted to the EPPAC website within a matter of days. And then sometime in the next week or so, we'll be sending out another communication about expected schedule for next meetings where we can bring the NISO back and potentially schedule future meetings out to discuss the citing methodology. So with that, thanks for joining, and we'll talk in a few weeks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.